Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we will start with that story that broke just before lunchtime on Monday that the BBC had sacked Scott Mills after decades and decades on the nation's airwaves. The person who's been covering the story all day is the BBC's culture and media editor, Katie Razzall, who's here. Hi, Katie.
Hello, Adam.
Right, give us the timeline of how this story emerged.
Well, let's give credit to the Mirror, because the Mirror had the scoop, if you like, that Scott Mills had been sacked for personal conduct reasons.
Oh, yes, because they posted their story at 11:30 on the dot with the headline exclusive, which was roughly the same time as the BBC statement went out.
Exactly. So we don't know the backstory to that. We don't know whether the Mirror had the story, went to the BBC then investigated, or whether the BBC, someone somewhere alerted the Mirror. We don't know any of that. But what we do know is the Mirror had it as an exclusive. We got this email. It was an internal note to staff, wasn't it, from Lorna Clark, who's director of music. Shall I read that?
Yeah, or read the most important bits.
So it was a shock. I mean, she says, I wanted to personally let you know that Scott Mills has left the breakfast show and the BBC. I know this news will be sudden and unexpected and therefore must come as a shock, not least to many of us who've worked with Scott over a great many years, because obviously, he has worked across not just Radio 2 most recently, but Radio 1, 5 Live, Radio 2, and of course TV. And then she goes on to say, of course, it will also come as a shock to our audience and loyal breakfast show listeners too. Yes, I mean, he took over Zoe Ball's breakfast show last year. It has about 6.5 million listeners. So it is the biggest breakfast show in the country. And he became the face of it, obviously, although can you say face when it's radio? Sort of.
Everything's visualised
exactly.
now.
Yeah, although not, it turns out not, because there's a key bit to this story, which is last Tuesday, he signed off his show saying, see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Said see you tomorrow.
And then didn't appear again. So it looks like they got wind of it and took him off on Wednesday. But when I tried to put that in my 6 o'clock news piece earlier, it was only the audio. So you say everything's visualised. It's actually not.
But going back to Lorna Clark's email, I mean, the tone of that is interesting because that's an email that is caring about the team and the staff and the listeners, not necessarily breaking the news to the wider world. That's not a public-facing email, is it?
No, that is an internal email. And when we went to the BBC, and obviously we've been given permission to use that internal email, but when we went to the BBC, their statement was, while we do not comment on matters relating to individuals, we can confirm Scott Mills is no longer contracted to work with the BBC. Now, obviously, behind the scenes, we were having conversations which confirmed that he had been sacked. It was for reasons of personal conduct, but we don't at all know what those reasons are or what that personal conduct or misbehaviour is. And, that's not to say that there might not be a story in a newspaper tonight, or indeed we might get to the bottom of it at some point, perhaps tonight. Who knows? But at the moment, it's quite murky. Well, not murky, that's the wrong word. That makes it sound nefarious. It's unclear.
Is there anything that can be read into that phrase, personal conduct?
Well,
because that suggests maybe, and I'm completely speculating here, maybe something that's not office related.
Yes. So the BBC always chooses its words carefully, doesn't it? Although it didn't put personal conduct in any of its emails or statements. But I think you're right that it seems to me, I've reported on quite a lot of BBC crises, quite a lot of them involving presenters who've done various things, including obviously things that have been criminal. There is an issue, in a way, you can't account for what people do in their personal time. As a boss, you can't be held liable for what people do, because some people, not just men, some people behave badly. What becomes a problem for the BBC is if it is something that its own culture allowed to happen or allowed to fester, and indeed then its reaction to it once it emerges. So in some of the previous cases, for example, and this is criminal. This is very different from what we know about Scott Mills. So I'm not saying what he's done is at all comparable. But when the Hugh Edwards scandal broke, and obviously people will remember it was very slow. He wasn't named at the beginning. Then he was. Then it emerged much later that this was actually criminal, and then obviously he was convicted of making child abuse images. that there was a suggestion, and that is disputed by the BBC, but there was a suggestion that the culture at the BBC enabled someone like that, who's a big famous face, who can throw his weight around, that enabled him to behave in a way that if the rest of us had behaved in that way, it wouldn't have been overlooked. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying that was the suggestion. And so the problem for this, the problem on the Scott Mills front is, did any of this happen? Well, whatever happened, was it on BBC Time? Was it something related to the BBC? If it wasn't, and it was something outside, then that's probably a very different issue.
The other thing that strikes me about this is just the speed at which it happened. What do we think we can glean from that?
Well, I think we can glean that the BBC held this culture review after what happened with Hugh Edwards and other high-profile scandals. It said, Tim Davie, Samir Shah, the chairman of the board, they both spoke to MPs at the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, gave evidence where essentially they said, no one's irreplaceable at the BBC. It doesn't matter how famous you are. If you don't live BBC values, you're out the door. And Tim Davie very clearly said this is a new thing, a new way of working. It's making that clear. So you could look at this and read it as, well, this is the culture review working in practice. So we've brought in new processes, says the BBC. We have looked at this, very swiftly reached a decision, a resolution. He's out the door. Now, of course, you could say that perhaps, and I don't know the answer to this, but one of the reasons why you could do this swiftly is if the person in question has held their hand up and said, well, actually, yes, that is correct. I've no idea whether Scott Mills did that, but it's clear that if he did do that, then that gives the BBC much freer rein to say, right, well, he's admitted it, so he's out the door. And it looks like you've made a really swift decision, and indeed you have, but you've been helped to do that by the person in the centre of it. Whereas, we know that in other cases, people denied for weeks and months that they had done anything wrong.
Or were suspended on full pay for quite a long time.
Well, exactly right.
Also, this is a bit of a sidebar issue, but it seems at one point we might have 3 director generals in the building this week.
Well, it's true. So Matt Britton, the new Google executive, the new director general who's come from Google after a little mini gap year, actually a bit longer than a year, he has been spotted here today. He was spotted in the canteen. He was, I'm told, spotted leaning over the atrium, looking down, and he's definitely been here. So he's here starting this week. The actual person who is going to be acting Director General for a bit while Matt Britton gets his, onboarding done and all the meetings he has to do and signs up to all the all the computer systems and everything. He's called Rhodri Tafan-Davies, and he's clearly he's acting Director General. And then Tim Davie until Thursday is the actual Director General, the outgoing Director General. And I'm not sure Tim was here today, I don't know. But I do know that he's here on Wednesday and Thursday.
And I suppose the fact that we've got 3 DGs is interesting because it makes you think, well, who actually made the ultimate decision here? Because the all-staff email we got confirming it to everybody was from Rhodri Tafan-Davies, who's the acting Director General.
Well, exactly right. And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that if you were Tim Davie in your last week, when you want to be celebrating your triumphs and thinking about that and heading out the door, do you want to have your name against the latest BBC scandal to break on your watch? So I don't know the answer, but Rhodri Tafan-Davies is the one who sent out a later email to staff. We haven't heard anything from Tim Davie about this story.
And actually, Tim Davie said one of the reasons he announced his departure in the first place was he wasn't really feeling he had enough gas in the tank to deal with another scandal.
Well, exactly.
He said
right.
it had taken a real toll on him.
Yeah, he has. It's definitely taken a personal toll on him. And I don't know, there have been some rumours that perhaps he regrets his decision. And I think perhaps having something like this probably reinforces, it's a good time to leave. A reminder that actually you don't want to have to preside over these sorts of unfortunate situations. Although I do think, and with some justification, both he and the chairman of the board, Samir Shah, will feel that this is definitely a sign of their processes working, that you make a decision fast. That's one of the things we've always criticised them for in the previous scandals. It takes so long to make a decision. Oh, let's look into it. Let's find out. Let's investigate a bit more. Let's check out our processes. Let's do this. Let's do that. No, in this situation, make the decision, and out he goes.
And then just a word on Scott Mills's career in this building and many other BBC buildings, because he was here for a very, very long time, 1998.
Yeah, so he is somebody who has, really, really achieved brilliantly, right? So age 16, he was actually the youngest radio presenter in the UK when he got a job on, I think it was called Power FM in Hampshire. So it's like a teen local radio star who then, when he gets into the BBC, it does do, really, really well. And at Radio 1, people will remember those kind of pranks that he used to do with celebrities. He persuaded Jennifer Aniston to give his mate a sort of nightmare interview. He played innuendo bingo, which he claimed Prince William was a fan of, where him and his friend Chris Stark and a celebrity guest sort of play out innuendos while trying to keep their mouths full of water. So he was a sort of popular person and clearly somebody that the BBC rated, because when the BBC rates somebody, they try to give them higher, more roles and sort of promote them so that it's a sort of, I don't mean self-defeating, do I? A self-perpetuating prophecy? No, whatever it is anyway. So it's the thing where...
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Self-fulfilling, sorry. Maybe I'll get my brain working by the end of this conversation. But yeah, so he got to present Eurovision and has done for years. He was a competitor on Strictly Come Dancing, I think back in 2014. In 2024, he won Celebrity Race Across the World with his now husband. So he's been, put out there across BBC channels and, on iPlayer and whatever as somebody, as a face of the BBC. And he earned a substantial amount of money and he did really well. And then, culminating in getting this breakfast show gig from when Zoe Ball said she was going to step down, this Radio 2 breakfast show, that, the biggest breakfast show in the country. Suddenly, like that, it's over. You're on air on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, you're taken off air or you don't appear again. And then that's it. You're sacked by the weekend.
So the BBC will have to find a new person to front that very, very high profile slot. Gary Davies has been filling in for the last few days. Scott Mills was also going to be hosting the spin-off podcast of the new series of Race Across the World.
Was he? I didn't know that.
And
top info, Adam.
And Eurovision is coming up, so a new voice to present some of the Eurovision coverage.
Because he usually does a semi-final, doesn't he?
Yeah, with Rylan. And then I wonder, well, I suppose it depends if more stuff emerges or whether the guarantees of people's privacy that we have in the UK, especially when it comes to HR, means that actually people can ask a lot of questions, but there might not be a lot of answers.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing. And for the BBC, it's... Has it contained the scandal? Is this it? Nothing more emerges. He's gone. Move on. That would be, I assume, how they hope it plays out. But if we get this sort of drip, drip, drip of people coming out of the woodwork and saying X, Y, Z about him, then it becomes something that continues to lead the headlines and make the front pages potentially, and that's a real problem.
And of course, Scott Mills, when he was at the BBC, was paid a lot of licence fee payers' money as a salary.
Yes. According to the last annual report, he's the BBC's 11th biggest earner on around between 355,000 and 359,999. Now, that's obviously the public service side of things. On the studio side, they don't have to announce how much people earn.
The commercial arm.
Exactly. The commercial arm, we don't know really what people earn. But on the public service side, he is the 11th biggest earner.
And have you managed to get in touch with Scott Mills or Scott Mills' representatives?
No, we've tried. I mean, I don't know what the latest is, obviously, because we've approached the agent and perhaps while I've been editing for various programmes, we've heard, but I don't believe we have. And we certainly haven't managed to make contact with Scott Mills.
Right, Katie, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
Let's get an update now on the US and Israeli war against Iran. And as often the way, the update comes from Donald Trump posting on Truth Social. And the post he put there on Monday morning is kind of in two bits. The first bit is him talking up the diplomatic process. And he says there's serious discussions underway with a new and more reasonable regime in Tehran. So he obviously feels he's achieved something a bit like regime change there. But the second part is him ramping up the pressure militarily and basically saying if he doesn't get what he wants, threatening to blow up electric generating plants, oil wells, and Kharg Island, which is a crucial bit of Iran's oil exporting infrastructure. So let's join some of the dots and try and unthread some of the threads about what might be going on. Joining me here in the studio, returning from his travels, is the BBC diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam.
How long have you been back from Ukraine?
Well, it feels like a month, but it's actually only a week or so.
And when you're in Ukraine, kind of in the midst of one war, are you able to keep across another war at the same time? How does it work in your brain?
I mean, actually, the longer I was there, the more I realised that these two conflicts were bleeding into one another. Not in a way that from a sort of clearly the Ukrainians and the Europeans have been making a strong argument that they are part of a broader war, that actually there are linkages between Iran and Russia, obviously. But actually it's been fascinating to watch Ukraine and the government there responds to this, mixed opinion, fearful of being ignored. Is Ukraine going to become a forgotten war?
But also trying to be helpful to the rest of the world.
But also now, as you say, trying to be helpful and learning to be a strategic actor in their own right, offering advice, how they do that, the complications of dealing with the Gulf, forming new relationships. Because if you think the culture between Ukraine and the Gulf, there's an awful lot of cultural hurdles to get over there. So it's been fascinating to watch that.
And it was really interesting speaking to Stephanie Flanders, our old colleague last week on Newscast, when she was talking about the increased level of strikes by Ukraine on Russian oil infrastructure, because, of course, Russia is benefiting from the conflict.
And as a result, Ukraine is now coming under pressure to reduce some of those strikes from countries that are worried about the rising price of oil. So, everything flows into everything in this.
Also joining us today, defense editor of The Economist, Shashank Joshi. Hello, Shashank.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I see James's two wars and I raise him three. I've got Ukraine, I've got Iran, of course, and I'm also keeping an eye on the bit that no one's talking about, which is the Afghanistan-Pakistan war taking place just to the east of Iran. So we're unfortunately in a time of great turmoil.
Do you know what? We might get a little sidebar from you on that third one a bit later on in this episode. But let's zoom in on the Gulf then. Shashank, I've just been hearing one place name all weekend. It's an island in the Persian Gulf, and it's called Kharg Island. Why has that suddenly become so important?
Well, it's interesting because Kharg Island has always been really important. It's responsible for about 90% of Iran's oil exports as a terminal and a hub for getting them out. That's changed a little bit. We can go into the details. But actually, it's always been very important to Iran for that reason. And so it's almost like one of those places in military history, like the bits of Eastern Europe that gets crisscrossed with invasions again and again. It was, attacked by Saddam Hussein, bombed in the 80s. Jimmy Carter considered invading and occupying it after the Iranian hostage crisis. You'll remember. It was Ronald Reagan considered attacking it and destroying oil facilities in the 80s over the tanker war when Iran was destroying tankers. And now Donald Trump has said, having already bombed it, that he may consider trying to seize it. And so it's back at the forefront of these Middle Eastern conflicts.
And James, what's our theory about why it would be in Donald Trump's interests either to raise the idea of taking Kharg Island or actually just taking it?
Well, it's a really good question because it's not as obvious as you might think. If you look,
because it doesn't automatically reopen the Strait of Hormuz, for example.
No, look, the overt reason is that because this island is the source of a substantial amount of revenue for the Iranian government and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the argument is that by seizing this island, you then control and cut off this huge source of revenue for the regime and its war machine. And you essentially gain a negotiating position for the United States. They can use leverage to try and say to the Tehran, right, okay, you've got to do a deal over ending the war and you've got to reopen the strait. That's the thesis. But what struck me from the interview that Donald Trump did with the Financial Times over the weekend was actually the way he was talking about that way we can get the oil. And the journalist at the FT who did that interview said on the BBC that the impression that he got from the president was, if uppermost in his mind, was the Venezuela operation, where clearly there is a sort of energy, sort of economic benefit that the United States can get from that. Quite how he thinks the US is going to benefit economically from this might give us a little insight into some of the other motivations that he's got.
Yeah, because I thought on first reading of his Truth Social post, I thought, it's the leverage point. It's the threat of if you don't do what I want in a diplomatic process, this is the way the military process will escalate. But actually, it does seem that there's more of a kind of mercantile calculation going on in his mind.
I mean, there are other options as well. I mean, Shashank will tell you, sort of, surprise is often considered a good thing in military operations, and heaven knows there's no sense of surprise involving this particular island. So the fact that so much has been talked about this has raised some speculation. Is there some, is this just a bluff? Is there some deception operation going on here? Is this simply nothing more than an attempt to put pressure on the Iranians, say, look, there are potential costs down the line, and therefore it'd be better for you to negotiate now.
But Shashank, if it is a bluff by Donald Trump, he's putting a lot of effort into sustaining the bluff because he's sending all these Marines to the region, many of whom have arrived. And Marines are the kind of troops you would want if you were going to seize an island.
Well, yes and no. He's sending these Marine Expeditionary Units. One of them is in the region already from Japan. That's the 31st MEU. There's another one called the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit. That's on its way from California. I think that's still a couple of weeks away. And those, of course, are optimized for one thing, which is getting boots on beaches, as they say. The only thing is, if you were trying to seize Kharg Island, and I don't want to give unsolicited military advice to Mr. Trump, I don't think you'd do it from the beaches. I don't think you would want to send in lots of ships through the Strait of Hormuz and the other way for very obvious reasons, that they'd be pummeled with missiles. I think if there is an operation on Kharg Island, you'd be looking at an airborne operation, an air assault, because you also have the 82nd Airborne in the region. These, of course, are paratroopers, and you can look back at American operations against airfields in Panama, Grenada. They could seize the airfield and then bring in more forces by air. That still has its own problems. The only thing I want to clarify in all this discussion is on taking the oil. Let's be very clear. Kharg is an oil terminal. You get oil from the mainland. It is sent by pipeline to the island and then exported. You seize the island, you control the transit hub, you can shut the oil supply off, although there are also 3 other sites further south that you'd also probably have to seize. What you don't have is a sort of free flow of oil. The Iranians will shut it off, and you've then got to get the oil on tankers, get it out of Hormuz yourself. And why would the Iranians let you do that? So what I'm trying to say is America can take this island, it can halt the flow of oil. It really, really cannot do what it did in Venezuela, which is say, by the way, I'm now selling Iranian oil on an ongoing basis.
Shashank, one quick thought. If it were an airborne operation, would the United States require some kind of forward operating base potentially in a regional ally that would have to allow the US to sort of base a lot of its forces that could then be used as a staging post before they get to Kharg Island?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you would need search and rescue assets in the region. You look at the V-22 Osprey, which is this fascinating plane. It's sort of used by Marines. It's got a pretty long range, and it can sort of it's like it can fly like a helicopter and also fly like a plane. It's tilt rotor. It can tilt. You may have seen it, in presidential visits to the UK and things like that. You would almost certainly need, Persian Gulf bases, access to those facilities to get an operation in. And you'd also want to resupply Kharg by ship from the other side of the Gulf. Even if you don't bring in ships through Hormuz, you'd want to get some across from the Gulf. So I think this operation doesn't really work unless you have a pretty decent degree of cooperation from Bahrain, the Emiratis, others. I think you need quite a lot of help in sustaining that air bridge. That really is the problem, by the way, because Iran will be firing at your runways. It will be firing at your ships coming across. So even if you can land paratroopers on the island, they then need short-range air defenses. They need fuel. They need ammunition. And all of that has to be supplied. And that supply line is what becomes the vulnerability for the Americans.
Of course, Shashank, there's another option that you could use those troops for, which would be to land on the beaches in the Persian Gulf on the Iranian mainland if you were trying to take out things that were threatening the shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
You could, though, and of course, it helps if you're going after missile launchers that are buried in these nooks and crannies of the craggy Persian Gulf coastline, hidden in caves, hidden in underground facilities. You might want Marines or special forces conducting raids ashore to try to root those out and find them, enable them to be bombed. And not all of that stuff is easily visible or bombable from the air. However, 2 caveats to that. Number one, there is 1,500 kilometers of Persian Gulf coastline. Look, America's not going to be occupying all of that. Secondly, a lot of the strikes on shipping are not coming from things, hidden on the coast. They're coming from Shahed drones. And as you probably know very well by now, Shaheeds can fly a long way. I think they can fly, 1,500 kilometers, more than that. You can fire these things from deep inside Iran, and nobody is invading 1,000 kilometers into Iran to stop that.
So that's the military track. James, what have you managed to glean about the diplomatic track? It's still quite murky, isn't it?
Well, it is what it is. Messages are being passed. We can have a semantic conversation about whether or not that amounts to a form of negotiation. But there is a form of communication, largely through the Pakistani government. There have been talks there in recent days with some regional foreign ministers, the Turks and the Saudis and the Egyptians and others. So, conversations are taking place. And yes, Donald Trump repeatedly says the talks are going well and progress is being made. He uses that phrase, talks. But both sides are still seemingly fixed into pretty maximalist positions. So the gap between both sides is huge. And neither side seems to be in that position yet where they feel they've exhausted military options, which is when, of course, those kind of conversations take place. But there are factors out there. There is obviously the global economic situation. There is the political situation in the United States and whether that has an impact on American thinking. There is also, again, we shouldn't ignore this, the thinking that's going on in Tehran. One of the curious aspects of this conflict is just how hard it is to report what's going on. Think about it. All sides are keeping a pretty tight control over what messaging is put out there,
which is why it feels a bit like a computer game some days.
Yeah, because even in the Gulf, where they're receiving quite a lot of fire from the Iranians, coverage of that is hard because of the rules about.
Because filming it on your phone is illegal.
Is now illegal. We're obviously getting limited access out of Tehran because of the internet shuts down. And the Americans at the moment, we're largely reliant on a commander-in-chief who speaks a great deal, but occasionally in contradictory sentences.
Could I add a word to that excellent point by James, which is not only all of that is true, but one of the other ways that I and other defense correspondents traditionally looked at these conflicts was through commercial satellite images of the ground. That's how we know, for example, that an American very expensive AWACS radar plane was destroyed in Saudi Arabia on Friday. But what's happening is the fog of war is descending over that as well, because American satellite companies are saying, hang on, we don't want to help Iran target its missiles. They are shutting down supplier access to images. One of the well-known companies, Planet, which has always been very, very open, has put a 14-day delay on images coming out. And Chinese companies are filling a little bit of that vacuum with images of their own. So are some European companies. But if I wanted to call up a picture of, US air bases across the Persian Gulf near Kharg Island right now from this morning, most American companies would say, sorry, I'm not giving you that. So that really is making it hard for us to track this conflict in the way that we could have done even a few weeks ago.
Interesting. And James, as the map of the conflict expands, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, they've become involved in the last few days, having previously sort of stepped back a bit.
Yeah, they've been sort of one of the dogs that hadn't barked so far in this particular conflict. And, obviously, they are players. They are, loosely aligned to Iran. They're not quite as sort of directly controlled by Iran as, say, Hezbollah or other organizations. But they have in recent days stepped up attacks on Israel. They've threatened to close that's their own strait on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula with the Red Sea. They've yet to do it in this immediate context, but obviously they've done it a great deal in recent years until a peace deal. But at the moment, so that threat sort of hangs over another key choke point through which a substantial chunk of the world's oil, I think about 10% of the world's oil passes through that. There's the substantial amount, obviously, from Saudi Arabia that passes through. And yet it's one of those, I think sometimes when you have a conflict like this, you become very focused on the here and now, and you forget sometimes that there is a huge capacity for escalation. So for example, the Houthis have not gone hard in yet. There has been some activity by pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, but there's greater capacity for them to become more active players. There is the possibility of Gulf countries actually fighting back against Iran. At the moment, they're just defending.
Although that possibility has been discussed for quite a few days now, and it hasn't happened yet. But it's your point about unpredictability. People have different triggers, and we never quite know where the trigger point might be.
And we always think that an unlikely thing is unlikely until it happens, and then suddenly it becomes, oh, that's happened, has it? And I think the capacity for this to escalate is always there.
Shashank, my latest obsession is this idea that after this is done, whatever this is and whatever done is, we end up with a situation where effectively there's an Iranian-controlled toll booth on the Strait of Hormuz, and whoever the regime is in Iran chooses which ships go through it, at what volume, and how much they have to pay to get through. Now, that then becomes a global issue of freedom of navigation of the seas, because a country's not really allowed to do that. That's what you could do in medieval times. You can't do it now. Then that would become, Keir Starmer's problem, maybe.
Well, this is extraordinary. I mean, 2 weeks ago, a US official messaged me and said, don't forget the toll booth risk, exactly as you say. And they gave me two interesting examples. One of them was the Bosphorus, which, of course, sort of in Turkey's influence. And the other one is Suez, the Suez Canal, and the way that's controlled waterway. And this is a huge problem. Freedom of navigation has been at the core of the international system for hundreds of years. It goes back to Hugo Grotius, the Dutch jurist. It's such a fundamental idea. But the really worrying bit is not just that Iran's in control, it's that America doesn't care. Today we heard the view that Trump saying we could end this by bombing everything in Iran and leaving. No suggestion he would leave by opening Hormuz. And worse than that, actually, about a week ago, and I know he throws spaghetti to the wall and sees what sticks, but it was still very troubling to me. He said, I might jointly control Hormuz with the Ayatollah. And by the way, this provoked one of the great memes, and I no way am endorsing Iranian state media or Iran's government, but the meme that Iran's embassy in South Africa published was a picture of a car, the caption saying, I will jointly control Hormuz with the Ayatollah, and then a picture of a children's steering wheel stuck to the passenger side. So they're mocking this. But more seriously, for Europeans, we are seeing America, the country that opened up global sea lanes, kept them open for world commerce, essentially abandon the concept of freedom of navigation, and indeed perhaps collude in efforts to completely overturn it. And I think that the likes of China in the South China Sea and others will be looking at this really delighted.
And James, I know you've got to go, which you'll be gutted about, because we're just about to get into a conversation about Hugo Grotius and why he was such an important figure when he was alive from 1583 to 1645.
But it does allow me to escape without having to tell you about how I once swam the Bosphorus. So I'm quite yes, exactly. I'm quite aware of that particular pinch point.
And also, coming back to the Dutch in ancient history, I mean, Kharg Island, where we started off, was a Dutch possession, wasn't it? In the 18th century.
I didn't even know that. You've told me that.
I've gone further back on
straight away. I didn't know that.
I've gone further back on the internet than you have today, Shashank.
Yeah, you've lost me. Sorry.
James, I'm going to let you go, but thank you very much. Good to see you back.
Thank you so much.
And Shashank, just picking up on that point you were raising about the other conflicts that people aren't talking about so much, just give a very quick rundown of why we should care about Pakistan and Afghanistan being in conflict.
I mean, sure, look, this is a full-fledged war, really, because Pakistan accuses the Afghan government, the Taliban, of sheltering a group known as the Pakistani Taliban, or the TTP, and they've conducted a suicide bombing, a very nasty one, a few weeks ago. Pakistan then attacked Afghanistan, and we're seeing airstrikes inside Afghanistan. We're seeing the Taliban send drones back towards Pakistani cities, and now we're seeing Pakistani shelling of eastern Afghan cities. So this has humanitarian consequences. We saw a really nasty Pakistani airstrike just a week ago that killed hundreds of people when they seem to have hit the wrong target. And of course, there's refugee implications, massive displaced populations here, lots of Afghans in Pakistan who are now displaced again. So this is the sort of thing, Adam, that would have been front page news 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but in our crazy times gets completely lost.
And it might have less kind of like direct political or economic consequences here in the UK. But back to James's point about conflict breeds instability and unpredictability, which can get worse.
Well, I'll give you an example of how these things are weirdly connected, right? I mean, so normally you think this is quite separate to Iran and the Iran war, but Pakistan, of course, under the new military leader, Field Marshal Asim Munir, is very close to Donald Trump. And Trump indeed has been calling him and talking to him about mediating Iran talks, as James will know very well. And so America is looking very favorably upon Pakistan right now and has backed the Pakistanis in their campaign in Afghanistan. Again, that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago when the Americans were quite irritated with Pakistan for their support for the Afghan Taliban, weirdly enough. And things have changed. And so these conflicts become intertwined in some quite curious and strange ways.
And Shashank, just to go back to the Gulf as we end the conversation, is there a particular aspect to this or place or thing or potential event that you've got your eye on that maybe is a bit under the radar for everyone else?
I would just watch the build-up. Let's see what they're sending into the region, track the planes coming in. It's a pretty small force right now. You know, the Marines I talked about, there's several thousand Marines, but there's only really a battalion's worth, 800, 900 worth of actual combat-capable forces. There's only a handful of F-35s on this unit, so they can't do all that much. So we need to see how big does that airborne component get? How many cargo planes are coming into the region? Where are they going? Where are they staging? That will tell us something about the scope of what Donald Trump is going to be in a position to do.
Shashank, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.